Hello, this is Domenico again with Easynomics, and we're going to continue our look at international economics, or in the new syllabus. As you'll see, I'm creating a playlist further down in my YouTube channel, the global economy, which includes international and development economics. That is for the new syllabus. Okay, we're going to look at export subsidies, and this could be used for an internal assessment. Perhaps for an internal assessment, you might be looking at the issue of dumping, and with dumping, you might be looking at a country providing an export subsidy. So this is a subsidy, as we've learned in microeconomics, a direct payment from the government. It could also include a low-cost loan, some type of tax relief for exporters, which reduces their cost of production, and that will lead to an increase in the firm's supply curve. Supply would shift out, which would lead to more output and would allow those firms in those countries to export that additional output. Under the World Trade Organization and for its member countries, export subsidies are prohibited, but they are tolerated for least developed countries, poor developing nations, where they tolerate governments providing subsidies in order to perhaps grow infant industries within those poor nations, which will create employment, jobs, and help them build economies of scale so that they can compete in the global market. Export subsidies are sometimes tied to dumping. You might have developed nations accusing each other of providing unfair export subsidies secretly to their firms, and then you can issue a complaint to the World Trade Organization, and they will look at that particular issue. And if the World Trade Organization finds that a developed nation has indeed engaged in providing export subsidies, then it is dumping, and they can be allowed to provide an anti-dumping tariff against the nation that has provided those export subsidies. So some of you might have an internal assessment. You might be looking at that issue, and so you might want to include an export subsidy graph to explain that. Okay, so for the new syllabus, you are required to know this model. For the old syllabus, the 2013 syllabus, it's not on that syllabus, but again, you can use it for an internal assessment. So here we're going to look at an export subsidy for a least developed country. Perhaps it's a commodity that this country is exporting. So perhaps it's the market for wheat. Let's say wheat as a primary commodity. All right, so there's a poor developing nation that they're being allowed by the WTO to provide an export subsidy to their wheat farmers. Okay. Now, first, before we get to that, we're measuring price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. We have our upward sloping domestic supply curve, SD, supplying the domestic economy, SD1. And we have our downward sloping domestic demand curve labeled DD1. Initially, when we have before free trade, where SD1 equals DD1, a market equilibrium price is established at PE. This is the domestic equilibrium price before the country engages in trade, and the equilibrium quantity at QE, where we know that the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And then this country opens up to world trade, and they notice that the world price is greater than their domestic price, right? So the world price is greater than their domestic equilibrium price, and so this country will export. And that's a result of this country having lower costs of production. All right, they have a lower supply curve relative to other nations. So because their cost of production or their supply curve is lower than that of other relative nations, they have the comparative advantage, right, which is a topic that your teacher or myself would have talked about in class, and I'll probably create another video about that. Okay, so that allows the firm to increase their output from QE to this point. So we're going to go ahead and label that. And I'm going to number that Q3, as you'll see in a moment, Y, and this will be Q2. So the quantity supplied increased from QE to Q3, and the quantity demanded falls because of the higher price to Q2. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and erase this. We don't need this for our model. It's just to illustrate why the firm is exporting, because their domestic price is lower than the world price. So they have the comparative advantage, the lower cost of production, and thus they will export. Okay. So this is basically our starting point. And then we would note that the distance between Q2 and Q3, those would be the exports before the subsidy is provided. So I'm just going to make a note here that these are exports before the export subsidy, all right, by an amount of, by, if you can read that, subsidy, an amount by Q3 minus Q2. That is being exported out into the world market. Okay. Now perhaps I'll label a few other points. I'll label this point, let's say that we'll call this point A, and we'll call this point B to also help us with our analysis. All right, fine. So then the government decides to intervene, and they're going to provide a per unit export subsidy. So for each unit that a producer generates, they're provided a sum of money. So we're going to assume a per unit export subsidy, which would have the effect of shifting the supply curve out by the amount of the subsidy. Per unit export subsidy. Okay? So for each additional unit that the firm is allowed to, is able to produce, they're going to get a sum of money. So let's assume that they increase their output from point B, let's say to this point C, all right? That would increase the quantity supplied from Q3, to Q4. Let's use a straight line, right? So from Q3 to Q4, quantity supplied has increased from point B to C along their supply curve. And we can also illustrate how along any point on their original supply curve, they can subtract the subsidy, and that will generate a second supply curve, which we'll show right here. Okay, so this will be SD2 shifting out in parallel to SD1. And SD2 would be equal to SD1 minus the subsidy, right? Pretty much how we would label this in a micro subsidy graph. What about the price? Price will increase, and this would be the price received by the producer. Price received by the producer will increase from PW to PW. So we're going to improve that. PW plus the subsidy. All right, and this will also increase for the consumer because the objective of the export subsidy is to increase output in order for more to be exported out of the country. So it disadvantages the consumers in the domestic economy. So domestic consumption, or the quantity demanded, decreases from Q2 to Q1. Right? Or from point B, from point A to point D, let's say. Okay, so we have finished drawing the model. This is what it would look like, but we need to add some labels within the surface area so we can talk about the changes in consumer and producer surplus, etc. So that's area A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I. All right, so we're done. We have finished labeling the graph. So I'm going to go ahead and analyze this as we would for a paper exam, and then we'll start to get into the evaluation. And one last point, maybe I can also highlight the increased exports running from Q1 to Q4. All right, so exports have increased dramatically thanks to the export subsidy. So now we can label this as exports after the export subsidy. Exports after subsidy. Okay, so as can be seen, we have a graph A, illustrating export subsidies for a least developed country. And we're looking at the market for wheat, all right, the domestic market for wheat. We are measuring price of wheat on the y-axis, and we're measuring quantity on the x-axis. We have two upward sloping supply curves labeled SD1 and SD2, SD2 equal to SD1 minus the subsidy, and we have a downward sloping domestic demand curve labeled DD1. Where SD1 equals DD1, you would provide an equilibrium domestic price, not illustrated here, but we could say it's price equilibrium, an equilibrium quantity at QE. And because the world price, when this country opens up to world trade, because the world price is greater than the domestic equilibrium price, this nation will export their wheat. And thus exports will increase from their original quantity of QE to Q3, while domestic quantity demanded will decrease according to the law of demand from QE to Q2. So the distance between Q3 minus Q2 will be wheat that is exported into the world market. But then the government decides to intervene, and they apply a per unit subsidy to these wheat producing farmers, or to the wheat industry. So for each unit of wheat generated, farmers will get a sum of money, a fixed sum of money. That would incentivize farmers to increase their quantity supplied along their original supply curve, SD1, from point B to point C, or from Q3 to Q4. That would then allow them to subtract the subsidy to then sell at the world price. Okay, that would cause an outward shift in their supply curve from SD1 to SD2, which again is equal to SD1 minus the subsidy. In terms of price rises, goes up from PW to PW plus subsidy. And I should state that this is the price received by the producer. Price received by the producer increases from PW to PW plus subsidy. Since the export subsidy is meant to generate more output for export, consumers in the country must also pay the higher price. So the quantity demanded decreases along their domestic demand curve from point A to point D, or from Q2 to Q1. That then allows for greater exports. Exports after the subsidy, exports after the export subsidy is now equal to the amount of Q4 minus Q1, right, which is greater than the original export quantity of Q3 minus Q2. So that is the analysis. Now we need to analyze. So let's talk about consumers. All right, consumers in this domestic nation do not benefit from the export subsidy. They are worse off. Why? Because the price that they're paying has increased from PW to PW plus the subsidy, right? They now have to pay this sum of money. That will reduce their consumer surplus. So I'm just going to abbreviate this. Consumer surplus before the export subsidy was equal to areas A plus B plus C. And then consumer surplus after the export subsidy is now reduced to area A. So we can go ahead and illustrate that. All right, originally, we follow our demand curve to the world price. This was the price being paid by consumers before the export subsidy. This is the level of savings by consumers in this nation. And now it has been reduced because of the higher price. Less savings for consumers, which means less spending in other parts of the economy. So consumers are worse off. Okay? Great. So now let's look at producers in this domestic country that is exporting wheat. We can see that consumers are better off. I'm sorry, producers. All right, so we're going to look at producers, and producers are better off. So they gain because the price they receive has increased from PW to PW plus the subsidy. All right, and that increase in price will lead to an increase in the quantity supplied. Quantity supplied increases from Q3 to Q4. Okay. In addition, we can discuss total revenue. Total revenue before the subsidy was equal to the world price times the amount of output, which is at Q3. And then total revenue after the subsidy is now equal to a higher price, PW plus subsidy, multiplied by a greater level of output, Q4. So we can illustrate that so we can visually see. So total revenue was originally the price of PW multiplied by Q3. This was the amount of output before the export subsidy. So this is the level of total revenue generated by firms in the industry. And then we see that it increases as a result of a higher price and as a result of more output at Q4. So this is now total revenue thanks to the export subsidy. So clearly, producers very, very happy with this. We can also talk about workers within the wheat industry. They benefit. More jobs will be created within the wheat industry, more employment. Right? So workers within the domestic wheat industry are better off. Right? Why? Because firms are now increasing their output. Quantity supplied has increased from Q3 to Q4. So farming firms will be able to employ more resources like labor. So there will be more jobs created. Unemployment will fall within this industry. So workers clearly benefiting from the export subsidy. You'll read that there's some argument that export subsidies create more jobs, and those jobs lead to higher wages, and those higher wages may lead to labor in other industries to demand also higher wages, and that could lead to a degree of inflation. So you can mention that if you wanted to in your evaluation. Now let's look at the government. All right, how does the domestic government do with the export subsidy? It's kind of hit and miss. They're kind of both worse and better off. We can argue both. Number one, we'll say that they're worse off. Right? Why? Because they have to allocate tax revenue. They have to pay for the subsidy. Right? So tax revenue is allocated towards the provision of the export subsidy. That generates an opportunity cost. They could have spent that money on other public goods and services. How much does that equal? Right? The amount being paid for the subsidy is equal to areas C, D, and E. C plus D plus E. All right, let me just go ahead and highlight that area. All right, this is the amount being paid by the government. All right, remember, it's an export subsidy, so they're paying a price of PW plus subsidy, or PW plus subsidy minus PW is the value of the subsidy, right? But they're only paying for the exports, and the exports run from Q4 to Q1. So it's areas C, D, and E. All right, so you can make a note that C, D, and E is also equal to PW plus the subsidy minus PW multiplied by the amount of Q4 minus Q1, which is the export quantity. Okay, so governments have to pay for that opportunity cost, etc. So they're worse off, but it will create jobs. So perhaps because of the increased employment within the wheat industry, you have more income tax revenue being collected by the government, and then leading to other spending by those workers in other industries, which will create employment in those industries. And so those could be some positive feedback loops going back into the government, something you might want to mention. So government's predominantly worse off, but also there's some benefits for the government. Now you can also mention one other thing is governments may create political tension if they're not allowed by the World Trade Organization to provide an export subsidy, and they are providing export subsidy and they are caught. That will create political tension between this nation, this domestic nation, and the foreign nations that are negatively affected by it. So you can also mention that as a consequence for the stakeholder. And again, if a nation is not allowed to provide an export subsidy according to the World Trade Organization's rules, and they are caught doing so, then the foreign nation that is negatively affected can apply perhaps an anti-dumping tariff. Anti-dumping, because the argument would be that the amount of Q3 to Q4 and Q1 to Q2, these amounts here, between here, Q1 and Q2, and Q3 and Q4, are being dumped into the world market. Okay, I can make an additional note that this is the dumped amount, right? From Q4 to Q3 and from Q1 to Q2. If a country is not allowed to provide an export subsidy, the dumping would be from Q3 to Q4 and Q1 to Q2. All right. Next, let's take a look at welfare loss. Welfare loss would be equal to areas C plus E, right? So let's highlight that. That is this triangular area and this triangular area. These are the welfare losses. Why? Well, area C, so I'll leave that. Area C represents the lost consumption. Consumer surplus has been reduced from ABC to area A. And consumers have lost this level of consumption from Q2 to Q1. So they should be consuming at the world price, but they're not. So that is a welfare loss that's been generated. In addition, area E is a welfare loss because we have increased production by a firm that perhaps should not be producing if they're not allowed to receive the export subsidy according to WTO rules, or if they are, they're increasing output, but the value of the government subsidy of areas C, D, and E leads to this welfare loss. And we can also mention that at Q4, with subsidies, we can argue that the marginal cost of the subsidy is greater than the marginal benefit, that we're producing, we're over allocating, we're producing more than what is necessary. And those resources could be used for something else. So area E, allocatively inefficient over allocation, increased production when a firm should perhaps not be producing that much, and then C, the lost consumption by the consumers. Okay? And last, we can discuss the impact on foreign nations, right? Foreign nations are negatively affected by the export subsidy. Foreign nations will experience a fall in their price, all right, because this excess amount of wheat is going into the world market and it's pushing the world supply curve down, and thus the world price will fall. So perhaps I should say that the world price will potentially fall. That will benefit consumers in the foreign nation, right? Consumers in the foreign nation will benefit, right? Because of the falling price, and their consumer surplus will increase. But producers of wheat will be negatively impacted. Producers in the foreign nation negatively impacted because, again, the price is falling. That will lead to total revenue falling, and that would also lead to their producer surplus falling. And in addition, it would create unemployment in the wheat industry in that foreign nation. So workers would also be negatively impacted in that particular country. Okay, and that's basically it. We've covered it. I will go ahead and leave this graph as is. I will show perhaps what the consumer surplus is, just so we can recap. Here's the reduced consumer surplus. And here we have the increased producer surplus. All right, producer surplus rising to this amount. All right, and that's it. If you have any questions, don't forget to comment, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.